you know, some historical mysteries, like they really get you thinking, and the YouTube video you sent about this Tartaria thing definitely falls into that category. I mean, lost civilizations,
Yeah.
advanced tech they had, even like whispers of a cover-up. There's just a lot to unpack.
It's certainly a compelling narrative, isn't it? This whole idea that there's this hidden civilization out there, right? And they had knowledge that's like way beyond anything we can even imagine today. It's always, captivated us, the human mind. But like with any good mystery, you gotta separate the captivating stories from, the credible evidence.
Exactly. And speaking of captivating, the video dives right in, presenting Tartaria as this huge technologically advanced empire, right? And it supposedly covered like all of Asia. They were masters of free energy, supposedly harnessing the Earth's power in ways we can only dream of. So what's the reality check here? What's the historical truth about Tartaria?
Well, the term Tartary does have a historical basis. But it wasn't this like singular unified civilization like the video makes it out to be. It's not that simple. It was more of a broad term, really, used by Europeans mainly. They used it to refer to these massive, largely unexplored regions of Asia, basically, beyond their understanding. Like, imagine if, say, back in the day, they just labeled everything west of the Mississippi as the Wild West. Descriptive, sure, but not exactly accurate, right? Not when you're talking about all those different cultures and people in such a vast area.
Okay, so Tartary was more of a cartographic catch-all than an actual hidden kingdom. That makes a lot more sense. But hold on, what about all these claims of like incredible technology? The video talks about etheric generators and buildings designed to like tap into geomagnetic frequencies. Can you break that down for those of us who don't speak science? What do those terms even mean, and is there any scientific basis for them?
Sure. Let's start with geomagnetic frequencies. The Earth, right, acts like a giant magnet. Everyone knows that, right? Generating this magnetic field all around it. And this field, well, it has frequencies just like sound waves have frequencies. Now, what the video is suggesting is that these Tartarians, they somehow figured out how to build structures to, tap into this geomagnetic energy, essentially creating free energy.
So it's like plugging your house into the Earth's magnetic field and never getting another electricity bill again. Sounds pretty amazing, but like, is that even possible?
That's where it gets a bit complicated. So we do know a lot about electromagnetism, right? And we've even managed to develop technologies like wireless charging that are based on these principles. But the idea of harnessing geomagnetic energy on a scale that could like power a civilization, let alone generate true free energy, well, it faces some pretty big scientific hurdles, let's say. Think about it. You're talking about overcoming immense energy losses, finding materials with like extraordinary properties, and frankly, you might even need to defy some of the fundamental laws of physics as we understand them today.
So theoretically possible in like some distant future, but highly unlikely with our current science and tech. Okay, what about these etheric generators the video keeps mentioning? What are those supposed to be?
Yes, ether. Well, ether was a hypothetical medium. It was pretty popular in scientific circles. Up until the late 19th century, I'd say. The idea was that it permeated all of space, and it was what allowed light to travel. So the concept of an etheric generator, it's essentially a holdover from that older theory. It suggests a device that could somehow, extract and use this hypothetical etheric energy.
So if scientists don't even really believe in ether anymore, I'm guessing building a generator to harness it would be a tad difficult, to say the least. It's starting to feel like this video is mixing some real scientific ideas with, well, let's just say more speculative, maybe even fictional concepts.
That's a very astute observation, and it really highlights why it's so important to be, shall we say, cautiously curious about these sorts of claims. Just because something sounds all scientific and uses fancy jargon doesn't automatically make it true.
Speaking of intriguing but potentially misleading claims, the video makes a point of highlighting Vladimir Putin's his apparent fascination with Tartarian maps. What's that all about? Is Putin secretly trying to get his hands on lost Tartarian technology or something?
Well, it is true that Putin has he's shown some interest in historical maps, that's for sure, including some that, depict regions that were once labeled as Tartary. However, we got to remember the bigger picture here. See, maps throughout history, they haven't just been geographical tools. They've also been used to, to back up political claims, to shape national identities, even to justify territorial ambitions. They can be very powerful tools.
So are you saying Putin's interest in these Tartarian maps might be less about, say, rediscovering lost ancient technology and more about pushing a certain narrative, one that maybe promotes Russia's historical dominance or influence in that region?
It's definitely a possibility we should consider, right? Because, history tends to be written by the victors, as they say. And maps, especially old maps. Well, they can be very powerful tools for controlling how we view history, how it's, perceived and remembered.
So instead of picturing Putin on this quest to, dig up ancient superweapons, it might be more realistic to see this as part of a broader pattern, right? One where history is being used to kind of, bolster national pride or maybe even further certain geopolitical goals. It's a good reminder that even when we're looking at the past, we always have to pay attention to the motivations and the biases, of those who are, interpreting that past.
Precisely. It's all about understanding the lens through which history is being presented to us, you see. And we have to ask those critical questions about who benefits from certain narratives. Speaking of narratives, though, this video takes a rather dramatic turn. They introduce this whole concept of mud floods, and they say that's what led to Tartaria's downfall. So what exactly happened, according to them?
Yeah, this is where the story takes on almost mythical proportions, right? The video suggests that sometime between the 1700s and the late 1800s, these massive mud floods, possibly caused by volcanic eruptions, swept across the globe, basically burying Tartaria and all its amazing technology under layers of mud.
That's right. And, they don't stop there, do they? They go on to claim that these mud floods, they weren't just isolated events. No, they were a global reset button, wiping everything clean, starting over from scratch. And that paved the way for what we now call modern civilization.
Wow, that's a pretty cataclysmic, almost apocalyptic scenario they're painting. Very cinematic. But is there any actual scientific evidence to support this idea of global civilization-ending mud floods?
Well, there are historical accounts of, localized floods and other geological events that cause a lot of damage, reshape landscapes. Volcanic eruptions, for example, they can definitely trigger tsunamis and mud flows that wipe out the surrounding areas.
Like Krakatoa, the eruption in 1883 I was just reading about, that it caused massive tsunamis, devastated coastal communities, even had global effects on the climate.
Exactly. And there have been many other earthquakes, floods, all sorts of natural disasters throughout history that have really left their mark on civilizations. These events, they can be incredibly destructive, often leading to major societal and cultural changes. But it's really important that we don't confuse these localized events with the idea of a single global cataclysm that somehow reshaped the entire planet, that wiped out entire civilizations just like that. I mean, there's simply no scientific evidence for that.
So localized floods and geological events are definitely a real thing, but this idea of one massive global event, one that wiped out a technologically advanced civilization like Tartaria, that seems, a bit of a stretch, doesn't it? And even if there were, let's say, massive floods or eruptions back then, wouldn't there be more evidence left behind, more ruins, artifacts, anything that might point to a technologically sophisticated civilization like the one they're describing?
That's a really good point. And while, archaeology is always evolving, new discoveries are being made all the time, the fact is there's just not a lot of widespread archaeological evidence to support the existence of a technologically advanced global civilization like the one they describe in these narratives. And while the absence of evidence, it's not definitive proof that something didn't exist, it does mean we should be approaching such claims with a healthy dose of skepticism.
So we have this very intriguing narrative, right? A lost civilization with advanced technology wiped out by these cataclysmic mud floods. It's a good story, very compelling, but it seems to be built more on speculation and conjecture than on actual solid evidence. And this is where the video takes its most dramatic turn, wouldn't you say? They bring up conspiracy theories. They actually claim there's been this deliberate, coordinated effort to just erase Tartaria from the history books. They even mention a declassified CIA document as proof. It's like something out of a Dan Brown novel, So what are we supposed to make of all this?
It's got all the makings of a good conspiracy thriller, doesn't it? This whole idea, these secret societies, hidden truths, it's definitely captivating, There's something about conspiracy theories, they draw you in.
No doubt. There's something kind of thrilling about it, right? This idea that there are these big secrets being kept from us, these powerful forces pulling the strings from the shadows. But like with those mud floods we were talking about, we got to, approach these claims with a critical eye.
Absolutely. And I'll be honest, governments and institutions, they do keep secrets. That's no secret, is it? But to say that every little weird thing that's ever happened in history is because of some grand cover-up, that's a bit of a stretch, don't you think? Think about the logistics of it. I mean, to erase a whole global civilization like Tartaria from history, that would take well, an almost impossible amount of coordination across centuries, different cultures. I mean, come on.
You'd think somebody would have cracked by now. People talk. And to keep something like that under wraps for so long seems pretty far-fetched.
It really does, doesn't it? Plus, you got to remember, just because there are certain historical periods, certain cultures that we don't have a ton of information about, it doesn't automatically mean there's some big conspiracy going on, right? I mean, there are plenty of perfectly normal reasons why there might be gaps in the historical record. Documents get lost. Archaeological evidence, it's not always easy to find. Sometimes it's just, well, biases in how history gets recorded, passed down through generations, you know.
Like that saying, right? Absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. So just because we hasn't found, like, definitive proof that Tartaria existed exactly as described in this video,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean it didn't exist at all. But it also means we shouldn't be so quick to jump on the conspiracy theory bandwagon without a good bit of solid evidence.
Well said. It's all about finding that balance. Being skeptical, sure. Questioning things, investigating, being open to alternative explanations, that's all part of it. But there's a difference between that and just straight up denial. You know, when people just cling to what they already believe, no matter what.
So we should think more like good detectives, not conspiracy theorists, right? Following the clues, looking at different possibilities, but not jumping to conclusions or seeing conspiracies where there aren't any.
Exactly. And a good detective knows that evidence, it comes in many forms. Archaeological findings, historical documents, scientific data. You gotta look at the big picture, weigh the credibility of your sources, and be wary of those claims that seem, wow, a little too good to be true, or the ones that rely on, flimsy evidence.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the tech, the mud floods, the whole conspiracy angle.
Right.
But the video also spends some time on Tartarian architecture, describing these really elaborate buildings, intricate designs, and they say these structures were built to, harness geomagnetic frequencies, channel free energy, all that. Is there anything to that?
Yeah.
What do we actually know about Tartarian architecture, if we can even call it that?
That's a fascinating aspect of this whole thing, isn't it? And it's true, many cultures throughout history have built these incredible structures. I mean, truly impressive stuff. Structures that show a deep understanding of, well, geometry, acoustics, even astronomy. The pyramids, Stonehenge, those Gothic cathedrals, these were incredible feats of engineering, architectural genius. And often they had this really important symbolic and spiritual significance to the people who built them.
So these buildings, they were definitely impressive for their time, but maybe not evidence of, alien technology or mastery of free energy.
Right. It's easy to look at these ancient structures now and think, wow, that's almost magical. How did they do that? But we have to remember, these were built by people, with the tools and the knowledge that they had available to them at that time. To say that they must have been built by some lost civilization or using super advanced technology, well, it kind of ignores the ingenuity and skill of the people who actually designed and constructed them.
So no etheric generators hidden under the Kremlin then. Bummer. But this brings us back to the mud floods for a sec. Even if we say, okay, this whole idea of a global flood wiping out an entire civilization, maybe that's a bit far-fetched. The video still presents it as a real event, something that actually happened, not just a conspiracy theory. So are there any historical accounts, any geological evidence that might support this idea that there were these large-scale floods back then, during the time period they're talking about?
Well, there are definitely historical records of floods and other, geological events that cause significant damage, landscapes being reshaped, that sort of thing. Like we were saying earlier, volcanic eruptions, they can cause tsunamis and mud flows that can really devastate entire areas.
Like Krakatoa.
Exactly. And there have been countless other earthquakes, floods, all sorts of natural disasters throughout history that have left their mark. And those events, they can be incredibly destructive, often leading to some major changes in, society and culture. But we got to be careful not to confuse those localized events with this idea of one single global cataclysm. This mega event that somehow reshaped the entire planet and just wiped out entire civilizations just like that. Because there's no scientific evidence to support that.
So where does that leave us? We can't definitively say Tartaria didn't exist, like we were talking about. Just because we haven't found proof doesn't mean it never existed. But at the same time, the burden of proof, it's on the people making the claim. And so far, the evidence we've seen, it seems like more speculation than concrete facts. And we got to be careful, right? Not to fill in those gaps in our knowledge with fantastical stories, however tempting that might be.
Very true. It's great to be curious, to ask questions, to explore. alternative explanations for how things happened in the past. But it's just as important to be critical, to demand evidence, and to really be careful about claims that rely on, well, let's be honest, unsubstantiated assertions, or the ones that just dismiss the mainstream explanations without a really good reason.
Right. It's about being open-minded and discerning at the same time. Remembering that extraordinary claims, they require extraordinary evidence, and that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. It's not about, debunking a conspiracy theory just for the sake of it. It's more about, exploring how these stories, they connect with something in us, this deep-seated desire for connection, for understanding, like our place in it all.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about recognizing that the way we understand the past, it's always changing. New evidence pops up, new perspectives are considered. What we think is historical fact today could be challenged, even revised tomorrow. That's what's so great about learning and exploration. It's an ongoing process.
And sometimes the best discoveries, they're not about finding all the answers. Sometimes it's about learning to ask better questions. So as we keep digging into this Tartaria mystery, we'll keep an open mind. But we're also keeping our feet on the ground, grounded in evidence and critical thinking.
Right, because when we're after knowledge, especially about our past, it should be a journey. And that journey needs to be guided by curiosity, sure, but also a healthy dose of skepticism.
Speaking of journeys, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from Tartarian tech to conspiracy theories, even waded through a few mud floods along the way. But before we get totally lost in the weeds here, let's take a break, gather our thoughts, and then come back for the final part of our exploration. We'll be back soon to wrap up this fascinating deep dive into the mystery of Tartaria.
All right, so we're back. And I gotta say, this whole Tartaria thing, it's really got me thinking, we've been on this, archaeological adventure, digging through all these layers of, speculation and mystery.
It really shows you how powerful these alternative histories can be, even when they, stretch the boundaries of what we think we know, for sure. And even if we're, approaching this whole Tartaria story with a critical eye, there's still something about it that just, resonates with people. Why do you think that is? What's the draw?
Well, I think it speaks to something very human, this desire we all have for connection, for feeling like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. This idea that, hey, maybe we're descended from this super advanced civilization, one that was maybe even spiritually enlightened. It's a powerful thought. And it kind of, it taps into this longing we have, this desire for a golden age, a time when humanity had all this knowledge, this wisdom that we've somehow, lost along the way.
Right, like we've stumbled upon this hidden family history, full of secrets and amazing discoveries.
Exactly. It adds this layer of excitement to the past, And maybe it even gives us a bit of hope, a little inspiration, because it reminds us that humanity, we've achieved incredible things before. And who's to say we can't do it again, right? Maybe we're capable of more than we realize.
That's a good point. But it also makes you think about, the dangers of romanticizing the past. Mm-hmm. Even if Tartaria was everything they say it was, it wouldn't have been perfect.
Of course not. Every civilization, no matter how advanced, they all have their problems. Internal conflicts, limitations, that's just part of what it means to be human. To look back at some past civilization and think, oh, they were perfect, they had it all figured out, well, that's just not realistic.
So maybe the real lesson here, the real takeaway from all of this, it's not about uncovering some, hidden truth about Tartaria or proving a conspiracy theory. Maybe it's more about how we look at history in general. It's about asking the tough questions, challenging what we think we know, and being open to different perspectives, even if they seem, a little out there.
Exactly. It's about cultivating this sense of curiosity, but also being skeptical, always looking for evidence, demanding good arguments, but at the same time, being open to the possibility that, hey, maybe what we think we know about the past, maybe it's not the whole story.
And you know what? Sometimes the best discoveries, they're not about finding all the answers. Sometimes it's about learning to ask better questions, right? The kind of questions that challenge our assumptions. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Tartaria, what would you say is the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing is this. Be curious. Be critical. And be open-minded. Don't be afraid to, question what you think you know. Explore different ideas, even if they seem a little out there at first. But always, always ground your explorations in evidence, in logic, and in a healthy skepticism. The past, it's like this giant puzzle, and yeah, it's tempting to go for the simplest explanations, but often the truth is much more complex and way more interesting.
Well said. It's been quite a ride, this Tartaria deep dive. We've come across some really wild claims, explored some really intriguing possibilities, and I think we've learned a lot about history, about how we view it, and about the power of these, I don't know, these mysteries that they capture our imaginations. And even if some mysteries stay unsolved, I think the real value is in the journey itself. It's about, searching for knowledge, and in the process, expanding our understanding of the past and ourselves.
I could have said it better myself. The great thing about history is that it's an ongoing conversation. There are always new discoveries being made, new ways of looking at things, new mysteries to unravel.
That's right. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, keep diving deep into history and all its mysteries. And remember, sometimes the most exciting discoveries aren't about finding lost civilizations. They're about rediscovering that sense of wonder and curiosity that's within all of us.